Hi, I'm Phil Candreva, and welcome to part 4 of this series on federal fiscal law, or otherwise known as appropriations law. In the first session, we provided an overview of this law and noted that appropriations are available to pay for things that a government official may need, provided they meet 3 criteria: that the object being purchased is within the scope of the purpose intended by the appropriation, that they obligate the government during the period of time the appropriation is available for appropriations, and that the amount spent is within the limits set forth by the appropriation. The amount characteristic is defined by the Anti-Deficiency Act, which is really not one act. It's a series of laws that have been enacted starting back in the 1870s and appear in Title 31 of the U.S. Code in several places. There are 4 ways that one can violate the Anti-Deficiency Act. 2 are embedded in this first bullet. The Act prohibits making or authorizing an obligation or expenditure from any appropriation in excess of the amount available in the appropriation. And we see parenthetically it also applies to an apportionment. And if you saw the first video, an apportionment is a portion of an appropriation. OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, typically apportions the budget authority available in an appropriation to an agency, often over time. So a fraction of the appropriation is provided in the first quarter, more is provided in the second quarter, and so on. So the combination of 1341 and 1517 say that you can neither overspend an apportionment nor can you overspend the entire appropriation. The next bullet says you cannot involve the government in any contract or other obligation for the payment of money for any purpose in advance of appropriations being made for such purpose. So not only can you not spend more than is available, you cannot spend it before it's available. And while this one is written with a temporal perspective, before or in advance of appropriations being made, it also includes the idea that you cannot buy things that Congress never anticipated ever putting in an appropriation. There are things that Congress may never choose to fund. So it's not only in advance, as if you are citing an appropriation in September that's not available until October. That's one way to do this. Another way to violate this is to fund something that will never appear in an appropriation. The last bullet is about voluntary services. There's a prohibition against accepting voluntary services for the United States or employing personnel services in excess of that authorized by law. And the government is allowed to accept voluntary things that are truly gratuitous. There are procedures for doing that, to accepting things for free, for people to volunteer their time for the government. That's not what this is about. There are rules governing that. What this is about are those situations in which somebody has a right to be paid and we're not paying them. Let's now look at examples of violations of each of these. So violations of 1341 and 1517 include a military service upgraded a general officer's quarters in an amount that exceeded the cap on such expenditures in order to avoid the situation where a new general or flag officer renovates their quarters with every new occupant. Congress has put a dollar limit on the amount that can be spent on such renovations, and that was violated. An accounting error created a mistaken belief about the amount of funds available in an account, resulting in over-obligating that account. A third example, there's a threshold for minor construction that can be funded with an operating account, an expense type account. If the cost gets above that threshold, it needs to be funded with the military construction appropriation. And here was a minor construction project whose cost grew sufficiently that it became an unauthorized major construction project. And lastly, an agency obligated funds in excess of the amount that was available under a continuing resolution. Looking at examples of 1341B, there was an agency that entered into a multi-year lease citing one-year funds. If you recall from the last video about timing, this is a bona fide need issue. And this is a good place to pause for a second and note that errors of purpose and errors of timing can also lead to an error of amount. So let's say I make a purpose violation. I buy something that should have been funded in a different appropriation. If, when I catch that error, there are no longer sufficient funds available in the proper appropriation, I not only have a purpose violation, I have an Anti-Deficiency Act violation because I have now overspent the account that should have been charged in the first place. If I catch that error while there's still plenty of money available in the other account, I can simply do an accounting adjustment and correct this without having an Anti-Deficiency Act violation. Okay. So a multi-year lease with one-year funds is a bona fide need violation that also is an Anti-Deficiency Act violation because you're obligating future year money that you do not have yet. Second example, entering into a contract in 1 year when work would not commence until the following year. If you don't need the service and the fact that work has not begun on the contract is pretty good evidence you don't need the service, you have probably violated, again, the bona fide need rule and the Anti-Deficiency Act, acquired 14 months of services citing one-year funds. Recall, again, the time rule. I can enter into a 12-month service contract citing a one-year appropriation, but 14 months would be exceeding the amount available under that one-year appropriation. And in the last example, and there are several examples throughout the federal government of this, there might be a reception or an event to honor something where food, alcohol, or other beverages may be purchased using appropriated funds when those purchases were not authorized in the appropriation. So this would be an example of buying something Congress never intended to fund. Congress is typically not going to fund the purchase of alcohol in an appropriation, with very, very rare exceptions. And the last set of examples, the voluntary services prohibition. We had a federal employee who worked while in a furlough status. So imagine a situation where there was a government shutdown or a furlough due to insufficient funding to pay for a government program, and a set of employees was put in a furlough status. If the employee works during that shutdown or during that furlough, this is a voluntary services violation. There's another case where an agency had a program with voluntary student interns, and it turned out that one of the interns technically was not a student according to the program definition. Therefore, they became an employee who needed to be paid. And lastly, there was a case of a contractor working on a contract with a specified period of performance, and the contractor continued to do work for the government after the end of that period of performance. This also would be a voluntary services violation because the contractor certainly expected to be paid for that work that they had done. I mentioned that the Anti-Deficiency Act goes back to about 1870. Here's a voluntary services example from prior to that period of time. This is a letter written by Commodore John Rogers, who was president of the Board of Naval Commissioners, a role similar to the Chief of Naval Operations today, writing to the commander of the Navy Yard in Philadelphia. And the letter is very brief. It says, "Sir, you will employ no persons under the appropriation for repairs after the close of the present year, unless they will agree to wait for their pay until the appropriations for that object shall be made by Congress." Prior to 1870, this sort of thing was perfectly permissible, and the employees would work, they'd keep a log of IOUs, and when the appropriation became available, they would get their back pay. We are not permitted to do that today. This is the classic voluntary service. So a couple of years ago, I built a database of all of the reported Anti-Deficiency Act violations in the federal government over about a 12 or 13-year period. And there were about 15 to 20 of these per year. Anti-Deficiency Act violations are taken very seriously. A report is generated by the agency head and sent to the President of the United States, the Director of the OMB, and key congressional leadership, identifying what happened and identifying by name the officials who are responsible. And no federal official wants their name attached to a letter to the President of the United States saying that you goofed and made one of these errors. And some reports note more than one violation. There may have been a misunderstanding about a rule that was violated 2 or 3 times. And so we see that the number of violations exceed the number of reports. They're not really common, but they're taken very, very seriously. What are some of the things that contribute to these Anti-Deficiency Act violations? A good number of them occur around the time of a fiscal year transition. And a fiscal year transition is a time when funding is tight, and it's also a time of evolving authorities. We also find more violations occur when appropriations are late. So in periods where we have continuing resolutions with temporary authorities of unusual durations, these kind of administrative mistakes can occur. We find an increase in violations when budgetary authorities have changed. Say a new program has been generated or a new restriction has been placed into an appropriation act that had not been there before, or an existing program changes the set of beneficiaries of that program. When you have programmatic changes like that with corresponding changes to budgetary authorities, the probability of a violation increases. So numerous examples of violations that occurred corresponding with changes to accounting systems. Either people did not understand the new accounting system, or the new accounting system did not capture all of the data, or perhaps there were delays in posting information to the accounting system that led to errors in terms of understanding how much money was available. And lastly, violations sometimes occurred during periods of organizational change. Changes in roles and responsibilities, changes in operational procedures within an organization can lead to some vulnerabilities where people are unclear about their job, or there may have been a control that had been missed on a process. When errors occur, there's typically some remedial action that's taken. And that remedial action is directed at the individuals who are responsible. But there's also remedial action taken for the organization, because sometimes these problems, the root cause is really something organizational, not a flaw with the thinking of any given individual. So what we find when there are violations, that individuals tend to be counseled, explained what went wrong. In some cases, they're reprimanded if they should have known better. Oftentimes, there's additional training provided to those individuals if they didn't really understand the rules. In some cases, they were reassigned or fired. And lastly, there were some criminal penalties. But most of the criminal penalties, although the Anti-Deficiency Act provides for criminal penalties, I did not find any evidence of anyone charged with violating the Anti-Deficiency Act, but there were instances where people were charged with much graver crimes: money laundering, embezzlement, theft, those kinds of things, through the misuse of government appropriations. Organizationally, what we typically see as a result of these errors are new policies and procedures, right? Training other people within the organization who may not have been involved in the violation to make sure that they don't commit the same error, right? New management controls are typical, to include a new review or something like that. And then lastly, occasionally there is a reorganization of duties if the current organizational structure was thought to be one of the root causes. So that concludes the 4th and final video in this series. I hope you found this informative and useful. and I appreciate you watching.